Hello and welcome to part 3 of Taking a Ride. Just riding around on the Spyder without any particular destination in mind. A couple of quick things to explain what's happening here. At about 2 minutes into this video, I'll come to the little village of Tarago, and at the Loaded Dog Hotel I'll take a left-hand turn and go up the Nerriga Road. The Nerriga Road goes to another little village. I'm not sure how far away it is, I think 30 kilometres or so of Nerriga, where there's a pub, and I'm not sure what else. There's certainly no petrol at Nerriga, but then the road goes all the way through to Nowra. At about 6.5 minutes into the video, I stopped the motorcycle for a while and appeared to be doing nothing, but what I was actually doing is taking photos of Lake Bathurst, which was on my left-hand side, looking back towards Goulburn, and you'll find the photos of Lake Bathurst at the end of the video. Now, normally I try to keep politics out of these sorts of things because I find that it can be polarising and people don't necessarily want to hear other person's views on politics. So I'm giving you fair warning. If you don't want to hear what I've got to say about political matters, then turn off the volume now and just enjoy the scenery. What I did want to do is talk about the recent referendum that was held in Australia and give you my analysis and point of view about it. Before I do that, there are a couple of things that I should say to clarify what I'm about to do or about to say. First of all, I want to acknowledge that the Australian people have spoken. This is not an attempt by me to criticise the result or rewrite the result or moan about the result. It's simply to analyse the result and comment on what other analysts and pundits and talking heads have said. I accept the decision that the Australian people have made. We were asked a question and people have answered very strongly in the negative. When I say very strongly, I think the margin was something like 60% to 40% or something like that. It was very clear that that the majority of people opposed the referendum. The second thing I want to say is that the Australian Electoral Commission, which is the body charged with conducting elections and referendums, did its job superbly. It administered the referendum the way it's supposed to, according to the legislation that governs its operation. Its procedures were approved of, and procedures that have operated since the 1980s were approved of in 2 court rulings. That is, that for a person to cast a valid vote, they could write yes or no, or a tick would be counted as a vote, but a cross would not be counted as a vote. And that procedure has existed since the 1980s. And it's been used in many other referendums, and as I said, 2 court rulings affirmed that as the correct policy. And I'm making that point about the Australian Electoral Commission because I think as our trust in the institutions of our society erodes for various sorts of reasons, one of the things that we can be pretty confident about is our elections are conducted properly and fairly, that there's none of this nonsense about electoral fraud or voter fraud or the sort of business that carried on the United States after the 2020 presidential election, and that the Electoral Commission does do its job properly. Now, that does not to say that there are not sometimes disputes about the outcome of elections, and the courts deal with those as a court of disputed returns and sometimes rule in favour of what the Electoral Commission has already decided. In other cases, they decide an election has to be reheld and so on. So I want to put those 2 things out there clearly. The other thing I suppose I should clarify is that I voted yes because I thought it was the right thing to do, although I would be honest and say it would have no immediate effect or no effect on my life at all. I admit to being a 70-year-old white person and therefore probably considered to be a privileged person. The establishment or non-establishment of the Voice effectively would have no effect on no impact on my life at all, but I thought it was the right thing to do. Now, I want to talk about why I think the referendum failed. And the first thing that is glaringly obvious and is a matter of history and is a matter that cannot be disputed is that Australia has been a federation and a commonwealth since 1901, when we adopted the constitution that we currently have, with modifications that have been made since then. But when I say modifications, there have been 45 referenda that have been put to the Australian public since 1901. That is 45 referendum in 122 years, and only 8 of those have been successful. So in less than 1 in 5, or 20% of the referenda have we approved of changing the Constitution? So I think that in simple terms, that might be a case of the Australian public thinks if something ain't broke, don't fix it. Or it may be a case of the public thinks that the Constitution is somehow a sacrosanct document and should not be changed except in really persuasive circumstances. And in this case, the circumstances were not deemed to be persuasive enough to do so. I don't think that was the sole deciding reason, but I think that was a contributing factor. A second contributing factor is that the history of referenda in this country shows, without a doubt, that unless there is bipartisan support for the proposition, in other words, politicians on both sides, that is the proposer of the referendum, which is the government, and the opposition, unless they're both prepared to say, this is a good idea, we support it, this change needs to be made, and this is why it needs to be made, then the Australian public will be looking and saying, you guys don't agree about this thing, you guys don't think we should do this thing or can't agree that we should do this thing, so we're not going to do it. And so if you don't have that bipartisan support, your referendum is pretty well doomed to failure. And in this case, when the referendum was announced, the National Party, which is the junior party in the coalition, immediately announced their opposition to it. And then after a little bit of prevarication, the Liberal Party under leader Peter Dutton also announced their opposition to it. There are some suggestions that if the wording had been changed or the timing had been changed or things like that, that the referendum might have succeeded, but I don't think that's the case. I think that the opposition were determined not to support this referendum because they saw it as, for a variety of reasons, they decided not to support it, and because there was not that bipartisan support, that was a factor in the referendum not succeeding. Now, there were some particularly unique circumstances, I think, to this referendum that meant that it would be unsuccessful. One of those, I think, was that there were some very high-profile First Nations people, including Senator Jacinta Price from the Northern Territory. She's a first-term senator and she's a First Nations person. Warren Mundine, who has been involved with the Labor Party and the Liberal Party and stood for the Liberal Party at several elections, and been an advisor, I think, at one stage to Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and Lydia Thorpe, who was a member of the Greens and then deserted the Greens and began to start as an independent. All three of those people were all First Nations people, and they all spoke very strongly against the referendum. Now, it should be said that Lydia Thorpe spoke against it for different reasons than the other two, but nevertheless, she spoke against it. Jacinta Price at one stage, when addressing the National Press Club, said that the stories that we've been told for decades about intergenerational trauma, about loss of culture, about dispossession of land and all of the things that went with that were a myth, that they applied to very few people, and they were basically that colonisation was a good thing for First Nations people because it provided clean drinking water and reliable food supply. Now, I'm not saying that's true or false. I'm saying that's what she said, and I think that there were some people that were persuaded to think, well, if that's what she thinks, then why do we need this body? Warren Mundine, in a opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald on either the day of the referendum or the day before the referendum, made a number of strong assertions along the lines, and I want to be as accurate as I can in quoting him and not misinterpret what he said, but he basically said, if I read his article correctly, that if there was disadvantage, it was only in small remote communities, and in fact it is in part the fault of First Nations people themselves. And he said, if First Nations people all had good regular jobs that they went to every day and sent their children to school every day, then the gaps that we talk about between the quality of life that Indigenous people or First Nations people experience and the rest of us experience would soon disappear. Now, it's true that education is the key to many things, but this was Warren Mundine's opinion, and I'm not, again, saying it's right or wrong. I'm simply saying that's what he said. Now, Lydia Thorpe, she spoke against the referendum on the grounds that she wanted truth, treaty and compensation first, and that a voice was unnecessary. Now, my view is that if the voice, which was going to be an advisory committee that the government could or could not list or could take notice of or could decide not to take notice of, wasn't going to be successful, then truth, treaty and compensation are certainly not going to be successful either. I think that one of the issues, not the deciding issue, but one of the issues was the media coverage. I don't watch commercial television, so I don't know how commercial TV, and I don't listen to the radio very much anymore, and I don't know how commercial radio covered these issues, but I do know that in the case of the ABC, which is the nationally funded broadcaster, the ABC's charter says it must provide fair and balanced coverage of all the issues of the day. So the ABC was required, the directors of news and bodies, people at the higher levels of the ABC directed those who present programs to make sure that if they invited someone from the Yes campaign to speak on radio or television or write about them on one of their ABC websites, that they had to get an equal amount of comment and time to a person from the No camp. And it was stated by Laura Tingle, who's an ABC political journalist for the 7:30 program, that in many cases, when someone from the No camp was asked to appear, they declined, and therefore someone from the Yes camp was disinvited so that the balance would appear to be there. Now, whether this was a deliberate strategy by the No campaign to therefore deny the Yes campaign airtime, I don't know, but it obviously meant that in times when you wanted to get a balanced point of view or you wanted to hear arguments, you were not able to. Commercial TV is not bound by the same requirements, and Sky After Dark programmers are not restricted in the same way. They can interview whoever they want, and commercial radio, especially talkback radio, can interview whoever they want and can say whatever they want if that is the opinion of the person speaking rather than the presenter. They're not required to have balance. So I think that was an issue, but I don't think it was a deciding issue. I think, in my honest opinion, is that the reason that this referendum failed was an economic issue. Now, what I mean by that is people weren't concerned about necessarily how much this voice would cost or how the people who were on it were going to get paid or any of those sort of things. The economic issue I'm talking about is the changing economic circumstances that have overtaken Australia in the period since the Labor government was elected in May of 2022. And what I mean by that is that inflation is now running at something like 5%. Interest rates that were at record lows are now up 4 and 5%, and the Governor of the Reserve Bank only today was talking about another increase in interest rates shortly. And what all that means is that I think that people were just at the stage of saying, I've got the mortgage to worry about, I've got rising energy rates and energy bills to pay, I've got grocery bills to pay, I've got car payments, toll payments, petrol to put in the car. These are the issues that are important to me. These are the issues that I think the government should be dealing with, and these are the issues that I need to think about and how I'm going to manage my affairs and manage my finances and manage my life. And I just don't care enough about this issue at the moment to find out enough about it to decide I want to make this change to the Constitution, so I'm going to vote no. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that Australians are all racists. I think that had the economic times been different, then perhaps this issue might have been more front of mind to some people. And to support that argument, I'd say if you look at the breakdown of the vote electorate by electorate in Sydney, in wealthy inner city suburbs on the eastern suburbs and on the lower North Shore and northern beaches, those electorates all voted in favour of it. In the outer western suburbs and the southwestern suburbs, people voted very strongly against it. In what is called the mortgage belt, and the belt where people do pay a fortune in tolls every day to go to work, and obviously are most affected by higher petrol prices. They have to drive further to get to work, or even if they drive to the park and ride, they're paying more in transportation costs than people who live in the inner city or live in the eastern suburbs. These people are also affected by high grocery prices because their incomes are lower. those people in those suburbs, and I don't think it has anything to do with their education levels. I think it just has to do with the economics of the time, saying these issues are overwhelming me or coming to the forefront of my thinking. I'm trying to pay the mortgage and the interest rate goes up every month and I don't know how I can do it. I don't know how I can keep the roof over the family head. I don't know how I can put food on the table. I don't know if I'm going to have to go without heating for the next few days in order to pay, in order to buy groceries or things like that. I just think that people were more interested and more consumed by that issue, by those issues, than they were by this one. And they thought, well, this is not going to make any difference to my life. I don't see any reasons for voting for it. I don't see any reason to change the Constitution. Had the government perhaps said, well, we will set up this body through legislation, the public might have taken a more positive attitude to it. That's my interpretation of why the referendum failed. It's based on me reading newspaper opinion pieces, by looking at posts in various places, looking at people commenting on those newspaper opinion pieces, listening to various people on television, on ABC programs talk about this, and in particular, as I say, looking at the comments that are posted by people who have commented on the articles and opinion pieces. All right, well, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed my analysis and it gave you something to think about. And if you didn't, hopefully you enjoyed the country and the scenery while you were watching, and I will talk to you again when I'm making the next installment in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again shortly.